He's out of his mind. Such are the words of some concerning Jesus in Mark chapter 3, verse 21. But who exactly? Let me read to you Mark 3:21 as it appears in 5 different English translations. First, the King James Version. When his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him, for they said, "He is beside himself." So in the King James Version, it's Jesus' friends who have heard that Jesus has returned home, and they believe him to be beside himself. Next, the New American Standard Bible. When his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying, "He has lost his senses." So in this version, it's Jesus' own people who heard of his return home, and they were saying that he's lost his senses. Next, the New International Version. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." So according to the NIV, it was Jesus' family who heard of it and who were saying that he was out of his mind. Next, the English Standard Version. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, "He is out of his mind." So, like the NIV, in the ESV, it is Jesus' family who heard of it, and who were saying that Jesus was out of his mind. Finally, the New Revised Standard Version. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." His friends heard it, his own people heard it, and his family heard it. And his friends were saying he was out of his mind, his own people were saying it, his family was saying it, and generic people were saying it. All 5 translations had the same exact Greek words before them. So what in the world is going on? Which, if any of these translations, accurately reflects the Greek text of Mark? Welcome to Amateur Exegesis. Grab a Bible and read Mark chapter 3, verses 21 through 35. You can hit the pause button if you like. The scene is fairly simple to follow. After the calling of the 12 on top of a mountain in verses 13 through 19, Jesus has returned home, probably a reference to a house in Capernaum. As in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, the people get wind of it and begin to gather together at the home in such great numbers that Mark tells us the disciples and Jesus could not even eat. According to verse 21, his family heard about it, and they decide they need to restrain him, because people had been saying he was out of his mind. Well, that is if you're reading the NRSV, but let's table that for just a moment. Since mental illness was often attributed to demonic possession, the scribes from Jerusalem charged Jesus with being able to perform exorcisms by the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons. Jesus responds in verses 23 through 30, first by revealing the absurdity of such a claim. If Jesus is casting out demons by the power of demons, Satan by the power of Satan, then Satan's demise is imminent, and Jesus' message of the impending reign of God is true. Jesus then warns them that speaking in such a way about the work of the Holy Spirit is blasphemous and will not be forgiven. In verse 31, Jesus' family shows up and call to him. Remember, Jesus is inside a house that is very crowded, and verse 32 tells us that he is surrounded by the crowd. They tell him that his mother, brothers, and sisters are outside asking for him. Jesus turns this into a lesson about true family. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother, he tells them in verse 35. The eschatological family of God goes beyond blood relations. Those who obey God are part of Jesus' family. The language of Mark 3 verses 21 through 35 make it clear that this scene happens on a single day in a single place. There is a continuity to it, but there are also some peculiarities. Let's return to verse 21. At the beginning of this episode, I read to you 5 different English translations of verse 21. All 5 are based upon the same exact Greek text, but they each render the text in distinct ways. Only the ESV and NIV are in agreement. But why? Why is there such variety in translation? It's here we have to consider the Greek text, and so I ask you, listener, to bear with me for the next few minutes as things get a bit technical. Let me read to you from the Greek text of Mark chapter 3, verse 21. Kai akusantes hoi par autou exelthan kratesai auton. Elegan gar hati existe. Did you get that? Good, let's move on. I'm just kidding. If you're like most English Bible readers, that wasn't helpful at all. So let me read the text again, this time offering a translation on each word or phrase to help you make sense of it all. Perhaps I should do a new introduction too. Welcome to Koine Greek for Amateurs. I'm just kidding again. Here we go. Kai accusantes, and having heard. Accusantes is a participle which, if you're familiar with English participles, is a verbal adjective. It's describing something. Hoi par autou, the ones from beside him. In Greek, this is an idiom, and we'll discuss it further in just a moment. But you need to know that this idiom is the subject of the sentence, and the main verb comes next. Exalthan, they went out. That is, the ones from beside him went out. This is the main verb of the sentence. Kratesai auton, to seize him or to lay hold of him. Kratesai is an infinitive, and it expresses the purpose of their coming out. In some places in Mark, the root verb krateo is used to describe Jesus holding a hand, as in Mark chapter 1, verse 31. In other places, it suggests something more violent, like an arrest, as in Mark chapter 6, verse 17. Elegan gar, for they said, or for they were saying. The verb here, elegan, lacks an explicit subject. Whatever that subject is, it must be plural, and the closest subject is found earlier in this verse in the words hoi par autou, the ones from beside him. Hati existe, that he is out of his mind, or he's out of his mind. The verb here also lacks an explicit subject, but it is obvious it is referring to Jesus. Now that we have that behind us, let me offer a literal translation of Mark chapter 3, verse 21 from the Greek text. And having heard of it, those from beside him went out to seize him, for they said, "He's out of his mind." Now, doesn't that just clear everything up? No, it really doesn't. The part that translators get hung up on, that they have such trouble with, is the idiom hoi par autou, which translates to the ones from beside him. Let's say that together. Pretend this is a Sesame Street episode or some other children's program, and repeat after me. Hoi par autou. Let's do that again. hoi par autou. Now, let's say it together. Hoi par autou, hoi par autou, hoi par autou. The ones from beside him. Now that you know a Greek idiom, let's dig in a bit more. Hoi par autou is made up of three parts. The plural definite article hoi, which serves in this context as a noun, the preposition para, which means beside or alongside, like in the words paranoid or paralegal, and autou, which is the third personal pronoun autos in the genitive case. In classical Greek literature, hoi para appears with reference to envoys. In the Septuagint, it's used in a couple of different ways. In 1 Maccabees 11:73, hoi para plus the genitive autou is used to describe the soldiers of Jonathan, who were fleeing in battle. In Proverbs 31 verse 21, hoi para plus the genitive autes is used to describe the household, the family members, of the proverbial capable wife. So the phrase in Mark chapter 3 verse 21 has at least three possible meanings. It can refer to his envoys, as in classical Greek literature. It can refer to his associates, like the soldiers of Jonathan in 1 Maccabees, or it can refer to members of his family, as in Proverbs 31. But which one is it? We can safely rule out option 1, that it refers to his envoys. The closest thing Jesus has to envoys would be the disciples, and as verse 20 implies, the disciples are with Jesus in a house. They wouldn't be going out from the house to seize him, nor would they be referring to him as out of his mind. What about option 2, that it refers to some associates? In context, the closest thing to associates would either be the disciples, which we've ruled out, or to the crowd, which has followed him and gathered in large numbers at his house. But this doesn't make any sense either. The crowd in the Gospel of Mark has been following Jesus because of his miracles and teaching. They are amazed at him, but there's no indication that they ever consider him insane. That leaves us with option 3, that it refers to his relatives, his family. Obviously, the construction hoi par autou can refer to one's family, as we already saw from the book of Proverbs. But does it here? I think it does, for 3 reasons. One of the literary techniques that Mark is fond of employing is intercalation. For those who don't know what intercalation is, think of it as making a sandwich. On the top, there's a piece of bread. In the middle, there's some mayo, lettuce, tomato, a pickle, and perhaps some deli meat. On the bottom, there's another piece of bread. These sandwiches appear all over Mark, in places like Mark chapter 4, verses 1 through 20, chapter 6, verses 7 through 30, chapter 11, verses 12 through 21, chapter 14, verses 1 through 11, and verses 17 through 31, and verses 53 through 72, and Mark chapter 15, verses 40 through chapter 16, verse 8, and, as it turns out, here in Mark chapter 3, verses 21 through 35. But how does it work here? The scene opens with Jesus at home in Capernaum, and the crowd gathering in large numbers. He had been away by the sea in verses 7 through 12, and then on a mountain where he calls the 12 in verses 13 through 19. But at the end of verse 19 he returns home, and in verse 20 the crowd begins to gather where he and the disciples are. Jesus' family learns he's at home and sets out, probably from Nazareth, to seize him, saying that he's out of his mind. But whereas one might expect the next part of the scene to be the arrival of Jesus' family to take hold of him, instead, we are introduced to a controversy narrative featuring scribes from Jerusalem. So, verses 20 through 21 is the piece of bread on the top of our sandwich. The scene with the scribes comprises verses 22 through 30, and in it Jesus points out the absurdity of believing that he is able to cast out demons by the power of demons. If what the scribes claim is true, it actually proves Jesus' assertion that God's reign is breaking through into the world. The demise of Satan's kingdom is evidence for this. Jesus also warns them that such a claim is blasphemy, since Jesus' power comes from the Holy Spirit, and per verse 29, whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. Verse 31 ends the controversy narrative. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside they sent to him and called him. Therefore, verses 22 through 30 are the mayo, lettuce, and deli meat of our sandwich. There is no indication in verses 31 through 35 that the setting has changed. The fact that Jesus' family has to send to him implies that they are not in the house with him, and it is affirmed directly by verse 32. Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach the crowd about the true family of God, the eschatological family he is creating. Whoever does the will of God, he tells them in verse 35, is my brother and sister and mother. By claiming Jesus was out of his mind and trying to restrain him, his physical family revealed that they were not doing God's will. The next verse, Mark chapter 4, verse 1, begins a brand new story in a different context, which makes verses 31 through 35 the bottom of our sandwich. So in Mark's sandwich, this intercalation, Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 21 is the top of the sandwich. Verses 22 through 30 is the veggies and meat, and verses 31 through 35 is the bottom. In verse 21, Jesus' family learns that he's returned home, and they set out to restrain him, believing him to be insane. In verses 22 through 30, they are still on their way. And in verse 31, they finally arrive. The intercalation strongly suggests that the idiom, hoi par autou, refers to Jesus' family, not the disciples and not the crowd. Now, before we move on to the second reason I think Jesus' family is intended by the idiom, let me complain about the way the New Revised Standard Version translates Mark 3, verse 21. Let me read it to you again. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he has gone out of his mind. This translation is perfect, except for one word. People. The Greek verb translated as saying is elegon, and it lacks an obvious subject. But Greek verbs are built to suggest one. In this case, elegon's form indicates it is in the third person plural. They were saying. But who? The closest subject in context is hoi par autou, which seems to be a reference to Jesus' family. The NRSV takes the verb to be one of Mark's impersonal plural verbs that appear elsewhere, but this seems unnecessary given the readily available subject in hoi par autou. Its rendering of elegon as people were saying obscures Mark's intention of highlighting the importance of the eschatological family over the physical family. Now, back to our three reasons. Another reason to think that Mark is referring to Jesus' family with the idiom hoi par autou is that we have manuscripts of Mark that have an entirely different reading. In Codex Bezae and Washingtonianus, both from sometime around 400 CE, The idiom hoi par autou has been changed to peri autou hoi grammates kai hoi loi poi, literally, the scribes and the others beside him. This change absolves Jesus' family of any guilt in trying to take him away or of accusing him of being insane. But the earliest readings we have of Mark 3:21 from codices like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus contain the reading hoi par autou. This suggests that a Christian scribe reading Mark 3 verse 21 and seeing this reference to Jesus' family changed the text so that it would be the scribes from Jerusalem who leveled such accusations against him. This strongly suggests the idiom refers to Jesus' family. The third and final reason for thinking the idiom refers to Jesus' family has to do with the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. As we've noted before, both Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources. But how do they handle Mark's sandwich here? Well, as it turns out, they've deconstructed it completely. Both Matthew and Luke have the bottom of the sandwich, the lesson about the eschatological family of God. You can find it in Mark 12 verses 46 through 50 and Luke 8 verses 19 through 21. They also have the middle of the sandwich, which you can find in Matthew 12 verses 22 through 32 and Luke 11 verses 14 through 23. But what about the top of the sandwich? Do we find anywhere in either Matthew or Luke a reference to Jesus' family coming out to seize him, believing him to be insane? No, we don't. Both Matthew and Luke have gotten rid of it completely. But why? Think back for a moment to episode 3 of this series. In it, we discussed Jesus' origin story in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. If you read those stories, you'll notice the supernatural nature of Jesus' conception and birth. In Matthew, Jesus is cast as a Moses-type figure, rescued by God in the face of Herod's wrath. Knowing how Jesus came to be born and how he was fawned over by the Magi, Mary, his mother, surely would never have believed her son to be insane. He was born for something special. This is even more pronounced in the Gospel of Luke, where we read in places like Luke 2:19 and 2:51 that Mary, observing what was happening with regards to her newborn son, treasured all these things in her heart. And given the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1 verses 46 through 55, it's hard to imagine that this humble servant of God would ever question God's son, her son, Jesus. So Matthew and Luke read Mark 3 verse 21 and immediately think, this can't be right. Both of them had a tradition about Jesus that pointed to his miraculous conception and birth. There's no way Mary would have thought of Jesus as being out of his mind. And so what do? Well, the controversy narrative, the center of the Markan sandwich involving the scribe's accusation that Jesus is demon-possessed, begins not with Jesus' family coming to seize him, but rather with an exorcism. This is far more fitting. An exorcism prompts the claim that Jesus performs exorcisms by the power of demons. This incongruity between Mark's version of events and Matthew's and Luke's depends on their varied beginnings. Mark, as we saw in episode 2, begins not with a birth narrative, but rather with a baptism. That is, Jesus isn't Messiah from birth, but from baptism. How would his family have known that he was the Messiah? His miraculous deeds and his radical teaching is what causes them to think he's crazy. But in Matthew and Luke, they knew he was special from before he was even born. And if he was special back then, well, he was always special. It's unfathomable that his family would think he was anything but important. Therefore, these varying views of Jesus affected even how these gospel authors viewed his family. These incongruities in the Gospels instruct us on what their authors felt was important and how they wanted to tell their version of Jesus' story. We could gloss over them, or we could do what we do in amateur exegesis. Let them speak, free of any outside constraint. Honestly, doing so is a far more enlightening experience.